So let me just introduce our second speaker. Sharon Vogel is a fourth-year PhD candidate and part-time lecturer in the Department of English at Dalhousie. Her Ontario Graduate Scholarship-funded MA thesis at Western University focused on the representation of witchcraft in Macbeth. Her SSHRC-funded PhD research has expanded to focus on representations of witchcraft in 6 different early modern plays, including Middleton's The Witch, Raleigh, Decker and Ford's The Witch of Edmonton, and Shakespeare's Macbeth, The Merry Wives of Windsor, The Tempest, and The Winter's Tale. Her project seeks to understand how these representations of witchcraft on the Jacobean stage function to critique early modern politics and society. Her paper today is entitled This Rough Magic, Maleficia and Diabolism in Shakespeare's The Tempest. And as I mentioned before, although she's unable to come to this session, she is at the conference. So if you see her in the lounge, she'd be happy to entertain questions at that time, and we'll use the chat function so that I can pass messages on to her after the fact.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for coming to this virtual presentation. This paper is going to be a short section of what will hopefully be a chapter for my PhD thesis. So if you have any feedback, I would be very happy to hear it. I'm still working on some of these ideas. So this paper is called This Rough Magic, Maleficia, Diabolism, and Witchcraft Skepticism in Shakespeare's The Tempest. Shakespeare's The Tempest includes 2 different and opposed magic workers. Prospero, the exiled magician who uses his art to restore his dukedom, and Sycorax, a foul witch who exists only in the island's past and never appears on stage. While Prospero uses Sycorax's rumored corruption to justify his own rule of the island, the 2 characters, as many scholars have noted, are almost parallels. So both are exiled from their respective homelands, both come to the island with a young child, both enlist the help of local spirits, and both threaten Ariel with imprisonment in a tree. Prospero uses Sycorax's cruelty of trapping Ariel in a cloven pine for 12 years to justify his own rule over the spirit as a better master. But at the end of his opening conversation with Ariel, he threatens, "If thou more murmurest, I will rend an oak and peg thee in his knotty entrails till thou hast howled away 12 winters." Though Prospero constructs Sycorax as far worse than himself, the kinds of magic the island rulers each practice demonstrates that Prospero is the more dangerous of the 2. Historians have noted an important distinction between common and elite fears about witchcraft. The accusations leveled at many of the women at the rural level are concerned with crops, cattle, and love spells, or malefic witchcraft. But when they are taken to trial, accusations turn to prophecy, devil worship, and regicide, or diabolic witchcraft. This disconnect between the initial action that sparked suspicion of witchcraft and the kinds of accusations leveled at court and under torture demonstrates the diverging concerns of common and elite accusers. Shakespeare's The Tempest includes both diabolic and malefic magic. While descriptions of Sycorax are limited to apolitical malefic magic, Prospero practices diabolic magic in a deliberate attempt to influence the political state. While Prospero constructs Sycorax as a foul witch, using her reported past to Maleficia to justify his own claim to rule, possible influences to Michel de Montaigne's essays and Sycorax's characterization suggest skepticism about the power of malefic witchcraft and Prospero's need to absolve himself of guilt by blaming an absent witch whose testimony cannot be properly examined. Though Sycorax is absent from the stage and information about her is scarce, the magic mentioned in connection with her is malefic. For example, malefic witches were believed to be able to control the weather and create storms, thereby damaging crops and livelihood that common people depended on for survival. The idea of witches causing storms appears to have been a widespread popular notion. So in 1592, a German visitor to England observed, "Many witches are found there who frequently do much mischief by means of hail and tempests." A witch's curse was also thought to bring disaster on ships. In a typical popular example of witchcraft revenge, a woman was accused of cursing a sailor after he insulted her and struck her with his musket while drunk. His ship reportedly caught fire for no discernible reason and sank with 19 casualties. In the Tempest, Sycorax, like these Malefic witches, is constructed as able to create storms and control the weather. Prospero says, Caliban's mother was a witch, and one so strong that could control the moon, make flows and ebbs, and deal in her command without her power. This reference to Sycorax raising storms, however, is never connected to a political agenda. While raising storms is consistent with contemporary beliefs about Malefic witches, King James and others who feared diabolism and attempts on the royal family feared storms raised by witches because of their potential for regicide. In the Tempest, both Prospero and Sycorax are capable of raising storms, but while the one mention of Sycorax and storms does not specify the purpose of their destructive power, Prospero's storm at the beginning of the play is for an overtly political reason. Even before the play reveals Prospero as the mastermind behind the storm, the members of court and the crew aboard the ship are fixated not only on their own personal danger, but particularly on the fact that the king is in danger. The boatswain exclaims, "What care these roarers for the name of king?" To which Gonzalo responds, "Good, yet remember whom thou hast aboard," clearly referring to the fact that Alonso's life is in danger. A little later, Gonzalo says, "The king and prince are at prayers, let's assist them, for our case is as theirs." And as the ship splits, Antonio declares, "Let's all sink with the king." The next scene reveals that the storm that threatened the king's life is orchestrated by Prospero for political purposes. When Miranda asks Prospero why he raised the storm, he answers, "Bountiful fortune hath mine enemies brought to this shore." Although Prospero is careful to ask Ariel if they are safe, he nevertheless raises the storm for the specifically political reason of restoring his dukedom, and in so doing, at least seems to endanger the life of the king. In addition to raising storms in an effort to restore his dukedom, Prospero claims to practice the diabolic art of necromancy, which was of particular concern to King James. In Jacobean England, necromancy involved not only exhuming dead bodies, but prophecy by the dead. In Daemonology, James writes of necromancy, "The devil will oblige himself to enter in a dead body, and thereout to give such answers of the event of battles, of matters concerning the estate of commonwealths, and such like other great questions." In one of his final speeches, Prospero claims, "Graves at my command have waked their sleepers, oped and let 'em forth by my so potent art." Prospero confesses to having exhumed physical dead bodies from their graves, following King James's beliefs about necromancy. By contrast, the play never associates Sycorax with necromancy or even prophecy, which is an interesting omission given the possible origin of the character. Kenji Go argues that the name and characterization of Sycorax may be derived from Michel de Montaigne's essay of Cannibals. He notes the phonetic similarity between the name Sycorax and Scythian, and argues that Montaigne's description of the burning to death of Scythian soothsayers may well have reminded Shakespeare of the same cruel method used in the execution of European witches at the time. The Scythian soothsayers that Montaigne references were punished for false prophecy, so if Shakespeare takes inspiration for Sycorax from them, it is interesting that Sycorax never performs any prophecy. Rather, it is Prospero who's associated with necromancy and prophecy by extension. While Prospero practices diabolic magic, Sycorax seems limited to Malefic magic, allegedly raising powerful yet not politically motivated storms and causing Ariel limited bodily harm. She requires help of her more potent ministers to imprison Ariel in a pine tree, and it was a torment which Sycorax could not again undo. Prospero's diabolic magic, however, involves raising storms against the king's ship for personal political reasons, much like a storm that King James himself encountered on his return voyage from Denmark, and practicing necromancy. Not only does the Tempest construct Sycorax's malefic magic as less harmful than Prospero's politically motivated magic, the play's possible references to Michel de Montaigne's essays demonstrate a skepticism of witchcraft accusations in general, and suggest that fault often lies with the accusers for inability to consider their own actions. For centuries, scholars have accepted Montaigne's De Cannibals, translated by Florio, as a source for Gonzalez's speech in The Tempest, Act 2, Scene 1. As early as 1780, Edward Capel argued that this speech was the only indisputable echo of Montaigne's in the plays of Shakespeare. Edmund Malone later argued that Shakespeare likely used Florio's translation of Montaigne's essays, a view that Kenji Go writes is now unanimously accepted by Shakespeare critics. Eleanor Prosser has argued that Montaigne's essay of Cruelty is a likely source for Prospero's speech in Act 5, Scene 1. And Gail Kern-Pastor points out, if Shakespeare consulted two essays of Montaigne not particularly close to one another in the collection during his work on The Tempest, he may well have consulted others. In several of Montaigne's essays, including Of the Force of Imagination, It is Folly to Refer Truth or Falsehood to Our Sufficiency, of Cripples, and of course of Cannibals, he references witches and European witchcraft trials. And in every instance, he demonstrates skepticism about witchcraft itself. He expresses his reluctance to trust his own judgment in witchcraft cases, and he suggests that those who make witchcraft accusations are blind to their own faults. In referencing Montaigne's essays, The Tempest demonstrates Prospero's hypocrisy as a ruler as he projects his own faults onto an absent Sycorax and her son. Since Sycorax is notably absent from the stage and only exists in the play's backstory, narration about her is necessarily unreliable. Prospero's narration about her is particularly so, since Sycorax died during the 12 years that Ariel was trapped in a pine tree, years before Prospero even arrived on the island. When Prospero asks, "Hast thou forgot?" the story he tells Ariel is likely a story Ariel told him in the first place. So Prospero says to Ariel, "As thou reportst thyself." And without any direct access to a version of the story from Ariel's mouth, it's impossible to say whether what Prospero says is true. Not only does some of Prospero's narration come secondhand, some of it was likely filtered through even more narrators. For example, Prospero says to Ariel, "This damned witch Sycorax, for mischiefs manifold and sorceries terrible to enter human hearing, from Algiers thou knowst was banished. For one thing she did, they would not take her life. Is this not true?" Though Ariel responds, "Aye, sir," there is simply no way to know how Ariel got this information and whether or not it's true, since Ariel cannot have met Sycorax before she arrived on the island. Prospero later tells Alonso's company, "Caliban's mother was a witch." Again, it remains uncertain where Prospero got this information and whether everything he says about her powers is accurate. Prospero's unreliable narrative about Sycorax becomes even more suspect in light of possible sources from Montaigne's essays, which reference witches and witch trials, and may also have acted as inspiration for the characterization and treatment of Sycorax. Montaigne's essays include an attitude of extreme skepticism towards witchcraft, which may find its way into The Tempest. For example, in Of Cripples, Montaigne recalls traveling through the territory of a prince who, in favor of me and to abate my incredulity, did me the grace in his own presence and in a particular place to make me see 10 or 12 prisoners of that kind, and amongst others an old bedlam witch, a true and perfect sorceress, both by her ugliness and deformity, and such a one as long before was most famous in that profession. He goes on to write about the trial process and his own discomfort in accusing the woman. He writes, "I saw both proofs, witnesses, voluntary confessions, and some other insensible marks about this miserable old woman. I inquired and talked with her a long time, with the greatest heed and attention I could, yet am not easily carried away by preoccupation. In the end, and in my conscience, I should rather have appointed them Helleborum than hemlock." He then quotes Virgil in Latin, a line that Florio translates to, "The matter seemed liker to minds captive than guilty." So he attributes the case to madness rather than malignant magic. Throughout Montaigne's essays, references to witchcraft are met with skepticism and attributed to madness or imagination. For example, in Of the Force of the Imagination, Montaigne uses witchcraft as an example of the potential of the human imagination to mislead, constructing witchcraft as only a product of the imagination. He provides two examples of unlikely sorcery: the case of Amasis, king of Egypt, nearly convicting his wife of sorcery because of his sudden and unexplainable impotence on his wedding night, and the ancient belief that some Scythian women were able to cause harm with their eyes. He lends no credence to Amasis's suspicions of his wife, writing, "He threatened to kill her, supposing it had been some charm or sorcery. As in all things that consist in the fantasy, she addressed him to devotion." Montaigne, making an argument about the power of human imagination, attributes this suspicion to merely fantasy. Similarly, after outlining the ancient belief in the harmful properties of witches' eyes, Montaigne comments, "Magicians are but ill respondents for me." In It is Folly to Refer Truth or Falsehood to Our Sufficiency, Montaigne not only attributes witchcraft to imagination, but says, "I was sometimes wont to disdain and condemn that for false, which to us seemeth to bear no show of likelihood or truth. And if I heard anybody speak either of ghosts walking, of foretelling future things, of enchantments, of witchcrafts, or of any other thing reported which I could not well conceive, or that was beyond my reach, I could not but feel a kind of compassion to see the poor and silly people abused with such follies." Montaigne goes a step further, not only suggesting that witchcraft accusations might be a figment of the imagination, but arguing that people should not trust themselves to make harsh judgments in matters they do not understand. He first decries his own tendency to dismiss the fantastical. "And now I perceive that I was as much to be moaned myself. Not that experience hath since made me to discern anything beyond my former opinion, but reason hath taught me that so resolutely to condemn a thing for false and impossible is to assume unto himself the advantage, to have the bounds and limits of God's will tied to his sleeve." Montaigne does not even trust his own judgment in such matters, reiterating in Of Cripples, "When all is done, it is an overvaluing of one's conjectures by them to cause a man to be burned alive." So he frames legal decisions on witchcraft cases as conjecture. Inextricably connected with the absent witch is Caliban, her son. Just as some of the inspiration for Sycorax may be derived from Montaigne's essays, Caliban has characteristics similar to descriptions also found in Montaigne's essays. Some have noted that Caliban's name is an anagram of cannibal, but his characterization also fits with another one of Montaigne's essays, which is Of a Monstrous Child, in which Montaigne writes about the experience of seeing a child fused to part of his conjoined twin. He writes of the, quote, "monstrous child, under his paps he was fastened and joined to another child, but had no head, and who had the conduit of his back stopped, the rest whole. One of his arms was shorter than the other, and was by accident broken at their birth. They were joined face to face, as if a little child would embrace another somewhat bigger." This image of Montaigne's monstrous child with 4 arms and legs is reminiscent of the comic scene in which a drunk Stefano discovers Trinculo and Caliban under Caliban's cloak and mistakes them for one monstrous man with multiple limbs. Upon discovering the monster, Stefano exclaims, "I have not escaped drowning to be afeard now of your 4 legs." Like the child Montaigne observes with the smaller conjoined twin, as if a little child would embrace another somewhat bigger, Stefano even characterizes the monster as having lesser legs. Montaigne also describes the difficulty of feeding the child. Similarly, Stefano has difficulty trying to ply the monster with alcohol. When Caliban appears to protest, Stefano insists, "Come on your ways, open your mouth." And again, "Open your mouth." And yet a third time, "Open your chaps again." While there is no accompanying stage direction, this repetition from Stefano to Caliban to open his mouth illustrates Stefano's difficulty feeding him, similar to the nurse that Montaigne talks about in Of Monstrous Children. Stefano also refers to Caliban as a mooncalf, or deformed creature miscarriage owing to the supposed detrimental influence of the moon. That's a note from Stephen Greenblatt. So that would be similar to Montaigne's poor infant. Additionally, just as Montaigne labels the child in his essay as monstrous in the title, Stefano and Trinculo continue to call Caliban monster for the rest of the play, even when the multiple limbs have been revealed as a joke. In fact, Stefano and Trinculo never learn Caliban's name, but go on to call him monster a total of 45 times during the play. While Caliban is only tied to witchcraft by virtue of the fact that Sycorax is his mother, his characterization as a monster from the pages of Montaigne serves a similar function. In the same way that Montaigne shows compassion towards victims of witchcraft accusations, he says of monstrous children, "Those which we call monsters are not so with God, who in the immensity of his work seeth the infinity of form therein contained. For out of his all-seeing wisdom proceedeth nothing but good, common, regular, and orderly, but we neither see the sorting nor conceive the relation." In the same way that Montaigne refuses to condemn witches, he refuses to be repulsed by the child with the conjoined twin, acknowledging that all people are created by God and thus have value, and treating all social outliers with a degree of compassion. So, though Prospero uses his own unreliable narrative about Sycorax to justify his own rule on the island, the fact that her magic is malefic while his is diabolic demonstrates that Prospero is the more dangerous of the two, deliberately using his art to manipulate the political sphere. Additionally, the possible influence of Montaigne's essays casts skepticism on witchcraft accusations and even encourages sympathy for victims of unfair accusations. Not only is Sycorax's magic represented as malefic and apolitical, the influence of Montaigne on the Tempest may suggest that the characters' narratives about her are not even true. Prospero's own diabolic magic, however, can be observed at work in Act 1, Scene 1 in particular, and throughout the play, manipulating royal authorities and securing his own political power. Though he condemns Sycorax for her cruelty and witchcraft, Prospero's magic is far more harmful than hers. Thank you.